Look forward to the passage of the bill through the Parliament.
I call the Honourable Member Moana Maki. Tēnā.
Thank you, Mr Chair. And I think it's always a shame to see the very good member Shane Ardern silenced by his government colleagues. Here is a member who has more farming experience in his little finger than the rest of the National Caucus have in total. And again, here he can't even take his full call because government members and his whips want him to sit down. And I want to reiterate the comments made by my colleague Damien O'Connor about what a shame it is that this member is not a minister. As chair of the Primary Production Select Committee, he's always been very good to deal with. For those members who haven't served on the Primary Production Select Committee, it really has a completely different culture from a lot of other select committees. It's very enjoyable, it's very collegial. The Minister himself was also a very good chair of the Primary Production Select Committee, and as a member of the committee that considered this legislation, it's indeed a pleasure to be able to take a call. And of course, Labor will be supporting this legislation, but I do reiterate some of the concerns that my colleagues have made and that were made in the second reading of this bill, which is that all the legislation in the world is fantastic, but if you don't have the people on the ground to ensure that it's carried out and that the objectives are met, then it doesn't really mean much at all. And there's no point having great legislation to deal with an incursion once it's happened if we're not putting as much effort as possible into ensuring that the incursion never occurs in the first place. And New Zealand as an island nation, I guess, has a number of advantages in that we're less likely that these incursions are going to take place. But from when the original Biosecurity Act, which is being amended, was drafted in 1993, obviously the world has changed dramatically. We're now dealing with far more international passenger traffic than we were dealing with at that time, international freight. And it is right that the legislation be brought up to date with the times. But as we've seen with the Varroa mite, as we've seen with the PSA, we are not immune from these incursions. And to see the kind of cuts that have happened in the biosecurity budget is very, very disappointing, because what we've seen in biosecurity is kind of a pattern that we've seen with the national government across a number of portfolios, which is in the initial years of their government make major cuts and then slowly dribble some of that support back and expect people to be grateful for it and expect the public to believe that that's actually an increase. But as I think the public know, and certainly as the sector knows who deals in this area, it's not an increase. We have seen a decrease in bodies at the border dealing with biosecurity, ensuring that the very basis of our economy is protected. And I completely agree with the member Shane Ardern when he says that in terms of the legislation we pass in this House, a lot of it is very important. But this legislation around biosecurity comes to the very fundamental protection of our economy. And that's why cross-party support is important, but it's also why we need to ensure that we have the capability as a public service in New Zealand to actually give force to legislation that we pass in this House, and that's where Labor does have some concerns. I'm very pleased with the provisions that the Crown is duty-bound to abide by regional pest management strategies. I work in the Bay of Plenty and have been dealing with the local authorities there. I was very pleased to take the Labor leader David Shearer to the Bay of Plenty to talk to orchardists about the PSA outbreak. I think it's really important that parliamentarians talk to those people on the ground about where they see the failings in the system as they have happened. And that's no kind of criticism necessarily of any government. Every government, when something goes wrong, should be prepared to stand up and take stock of what happened, where the gaps were, and learn from that. And certainly in the Bay of Plenty, there's been a lot of frustration around how the PSA outbreak could have been handled differently, about whether some of the cuts in biosecurity might have led to the PSA incursion. And it's a bit of a cautionary tale, I think, because if I look at my own portfolios of climate change, we have a very monocultural forestry industry in this country around Pinus radiata. There are a number of pests which would be devastating to our forestry industry. Some of those pests are already in New Zealand. They've been benign so far, and let's hope, absolutely touch wood, no pun intended, that they remain benign. But there are also a number of pests internationally which could very, very easily, as was the case with PSA, enter New Zealand. Now, when you look at how monocultural our forestry industry is, that's a real concern, and that's why this legislation and why support and funding for biosecurity is so crucial. Because, Mr Chair,
I call the honourable member Moana Mackey.
Thank you, Mr Chair. Because if you just simply want to look narrowly at our international obligations under Kyoto, under this government our greenhouse gas emissions, gross emissions, are continuing to rise. Now, the government says they're focusing on net emissions. Well, that relies on mitigation. The only mitigation we have in New Zealand is forestry. So if we were to lose a significant proportion of our forestry industry because of a pest incursion, that would mean a massive liability for the government. We literally have all of our eggs in that one basket, not just in terms of forestry, but in terms of Pinus radiata. And so, whilst sometimes it may feel like we're debating kind of ethereally about some of this stuff, in reality this is just about as crucial as it gets in terms of the New Zealand economy. Now I want to make some comments because Part 1 amends a number of principal acts, and one of the acts that it amends is the scope of the Wild Animal Control Act 1977, and one of my concerns across a number of areas with this national government is all these changes being made to different acts where the left hand and the right hand really don't seem to know what each other are doing. And we have a piece of legislation at Select Committee at the moment, the Game Animal Council legislation. And when I read the changes that we're making here in the Biosecurity Bill amendments to that piece of legislation, they seem to run right up against the changes that the government has made because of their confidence and supply agreement with Peter Dunn to the Game Animal Council legislation. And I hope that the Minister has taken this into consideration, that the very kind of worthy reasons that he's given around possums and wallabies and the need to control those particular species aren't undermined by some of the changes that are being made at Select Committee at the moment. And we've heard a number of submitters, including the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment, who submitted specifically on this issue, who is concerned about the loss of control or the loss of sovereignty from the Department of Conservation in terms of animal pest control, particularly possums and the 1080 strategy, by handing that over to some kind of independent, separate from government body, that there may be a loss of the ability for government to ensure that pest management is adequately controlled. And so I sincerely hope that the Minister has taken into account the effect of that piece of legislation on the ability of this particular legislation to deliver what it's promising. Now, the other thing I found particularly interesting, especially given the previous bill that we've just been debating, is that this bill extends the application of the Biosecurity Act into the exclusive economic zone. Now, I find this particularly interesting because we've had a long-running debate at the Local Government and Environment Select Committee, and indeed in the second reading of the exclusive economic zone legislation in this House, about whether or not legislation which governs New Zealand's sovereign territory can be extended out into our exclusive economic zone, where we don't have the same level of sovereignty, where we're guided by international conventions. And we keep being told by the government that when it comes to the RMA, we just can't do that. We just can't do that because that's not our sovereign territory. This is our sovereign territory. And here we are, the very next bill that we're debating, and apparently the Biosecurity Act can operate quite comfortably in the exclusive economic zone. We also know that the Health and Safety and Employment Act can operate quite comfortably in the exclusive economic zone. We also know that the Maritime Act can operate quite comfortably in the exclusive economic zone. So the question has to be asked, why is the RMA apparently the only piece of legislation in New Zealand that can't operate in the exclusive economic zone? It is very bad timing because it shows up the deficiencies of the government's arguments in the previous legislation, which is you can't possibly do that because of the issues around sovereignty. That's not true. It's simply that they didn't want to have those kind of well-known, well-understood, well-tested legal tests in the exclusive economic zone. But I welcome the Biosecurity Act being extended into the exclusive economic zone. Labor wishes that the government would show a little bit more consistency on this. I notice the Minister of Energy is in the House. He might want to, he's squinting a little bit. He might want to, I know it's tough, it's 20 to 10, Minister, it's well past your bedtime, but you might want to take note of this, because this is the Minister who is in charge of ramping up this activity in the exclusive economic zone without protections, who argues that this legislation can't be extended into the exclusive economic zone. He's now sitting in the House listening to his Cabinet colleague David Carter, his parliamentary colleagues, talking about how it's so important that the Biosecurity Act be extended in the exclusive economic zone. All we'd ask, Minister, is some consistency from this national government. But, Mr Chair, Labor is happy to support this piece of legislation.
I call the honourable member to Iraroa Flavel.
Thank you very much, tēnā koutou.